Hello everyone, my name is Preston, Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I've got a very unusual episode today. I always say that, but this one is really unusual, I think. I call it ET's Love Alfalfa. And by alfalfa, I don't mean the little rascal, I mean the food crop. It's a food source both for humans, for livestock, for animals of all kinds. In fact, alfalfa has been farmed for thousands of years. It's an excellent food crop. It actually puts lots of nitrogen into the soil, and it's very widely used across the world for good reasons. I mean, it has all kinds of vitamins, including vitamin K, vitamin C. It's got folates, thiamine, riboflavin, magnesium, iron, and copper. And it's also got a lot of medicinal properties. It's very valuable health-wise. It's been known to lower cholesterol. It's used to decrease blood pressure, decrease blood sugar. It improves cardiometabolic health. And it's a powerful antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. And apparently the ETs love it too. Perhaps they know this. Perhaps this is why I found so many cases of ETs hovering at very low altitude over alfalfa crops, but more often landing, and in a number of cases humanoids. I mean, these cases are really interesting. I'm going to present about 20 cases today, traveling through time, starting in the early 1950s all the way up to the 2000s. So you can see this is a very consistent feature of UFO encounters. Now there's something about alfalfa that is attracting ETs. I first heard about this from researcher Gordon Creighton, and he's a longtime pioneering researcher, now deceased. But I read a quote from him about this connection to UFO encounters and the alfalfa crop. And as Gordon Creighton says, the occupants of mysterious craft have been reported to have shown an unusual interest in the animal food crop alfalfa. So yeah, when I heard that I thought, I know of some cases, and that's when I decided to dig deep, and I did find 20 cases. As always, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. It would be very easy to find a lot more cases like these, but I picked out 20 of what I think are the more interesting and better authenticated cases of this kind. And I find it very interesting because I think this shows some interesting aspects to ET behavior. They're clearly interested in alfalfa. So I actually asked Dolly Safran about this. For those of you who don't know Dolly Safran, she is a contactee, fully conscious. I wrote a book about her encounters called Symmetry, and I thought she might have some interesting insights into this, so I asked her, and she says, oh yeah, she is quite familiar with the fact that ETs do in fact eat alfalfa, just like we do. So I thought that was interesting. These cases, I think, show sort of a human side to ETs, and I think these cases have something to teach us about not only ET behavior, but who they are. So that's really why I wanted to present these cases today. That and because they're so interesting. They provide all kinds of evidence. This is not just eyewitness testimony. In fact, the majority of these cases do have physical evidence. And by that I mean landing traces, animal reactions, some cases physiological reactions. And I love the fact that quite a few of them actually involve humanoids. So I think you'll find it interesting. I certainly hope so. Again, 20 cases, that's a lot to cover, so let's just get started. Now, these cases do occur all over the world, but the first case I'd like to cover occurred in Rosamond, California. And this case comes from pioneering UFO researcher James McDonald, and this involves a very low-flying disc. It was in January of 1950 when John Gettys, his wife, and young daughter were in their farmhouse in Rosamond when a UFO hovered directly over their house. So their farmhouse was surrounded by fields of alfalfa, and this disc hovered so low it shook the entire house. That's not the only thing. It disturbed their television set, and it sent weird vibrations through their bodies. So this is a weird physiological effect. And in fact, John Gettys said it was the most vivid experience of his entire life. It's a good case involving both electromagnetic and physiological effects. And the question is, why was it hovering so low over the house? Could it have been attracted to the alfalfa fields? It's a bit circumstantial in this case, but as we go on, we'll see these cases definitely do show an interest on the ET's part in alfalfa. Moving along to 3 years later, this next case occurred in Tome, New Mexico, and this was in December of 1953. This case first appeared in the Albuquerque Journal newspaper and was later reported to researcher Donald Kehoe, a very well-respected researcher. The main witnesses were Julian Torres, a farmer, and his wife. They were woken up at around 2 a.m. by the frantic barking of their dog. So Torres jumps up and grabs his gun because he thought someone might be trying to steal his newborn calf. But instead, he saw a 14-foot wide object, glowing orange-red, and hovering mere feet above his alfalfa field. This was only about 500 feet from his farmhouse. Now his wife, she came outside too, took one look at it, and ran back inside. This object remained in place for about 3 to 4 minutes, which is a pretty long time for an object that is that low. And at this point, the object flared up and ascended at a 45-degree angle into the sky and was gone. So there's no word about any marks in the field, but this is a good example of an animal reaction case, and again, a UFO hovering at very low level over an alfalfa field. Here's an even better case. A lot of these cases are quite brief, so I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. But this next case occurred in Orland, California. This was on September 10, 1962, and we actually know the exact location. This is located at 4th Avenue and Wyo Road. This was reported to APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and the main witness is rancher A.T. Gray. Now, Gray was helping out his friend John Gilmore, who actually owned this farm in Orland, and Gray went out into the fields to shut off an irrigation pump in the alfalfa field. And this is when he saw what he first thought were actually a couple of cars with their lights on parked in the field. So he drove out there and he saw that this was not 2 cars. This was actually an object floating in the air. At this point he thought it might be a helicopter, but it was clear that it wasn't. And as he got close, he could see that this object was pretty much silent, and it was not a helicopter. He saw instead a, quote, blunt-shaped object, and it was hovering only 20 feet in the air. That's very low. It had 2 lights on each side. Each of these lights were about 3 feet in diameter, so pretty big, and they were shining down onto the alfalfa field. Now you could see at this point, or hear, that this object was making a soft swishing noise, and when he started to approach it closer, he got to within 150 feet of it. This object then zoomed towards him, actually skimming the ground, and then zipped off very quickly. And in fact, according to Gray, it moved so quickly it was out of sight in 3 to 4 seconds. And as rancher Gray says, "I tell you, it gives a man a darn funny feeling. Boy, it sure threw me for a loop. I'll tell you one thing, I'm sure going to keep an eye on this area. I'd sure like to have a better look at that thing." So the owner of the ranch, John Gilmore, reported it to the sheriff's office, who told the Orland, California Register newspaper, and that's how this case found its way to UFO researchers. It's a pretty interesting case, and they just get more interesting as time goes on. Here's a very brief case which occurred in Tucumán, Argentina in December 1965. The main witness in this case is a farmer by the name of Antonio Lozano, and he saw this brilliant red light actually land in his alfalfa field. After just a few moments, this object took off, and the farmer Antonio went into his alfalfa field, and this is when he found a large, curved, forked, burned impression in his alfalfa field. And he measured it. It was about 15 feet in diameter. So this was not a huge craft, but certainly not a tiny little thing, and is one of many, many cases of this kind involving landing traces. Now here's another very interesting case. This was 4 years later, March 23rd, 1969, and this occurred in Marshall, Michigan. The main witness is Wayne Kidder, his wife, and their son Brian. And they were in their home in Marshall. It was around 11 a.m., so this is a daylight sighting, when they saw a dome-shaped object just sitting there in their alfalfa field. This object was a shiny metal and glinted in the morning sun, and was pretty big. It was about, they estimate, 50 to 60 feet wide and 15 to 20 feet high. So as the main witness, Wayne, says, it was a solid object which had the appearance of stainless steel or aluminum. And they actually watched it for 20 minutes, a very long time. It was quite cold out, so they went inside to get their coats, and when they came back out, the object was gone. Now, this was investigated by a gentleman by the name of Reverend Gerald F. Boyer, and it's an interesting case of a UFO landing in an alfalfa field. Here, this next case is probably one of my favorite of this whole presentation, and this occurred in Europe, actually in Valladolid, Spain. Valladolid, Spain. This is on August 16, 1970, and one of the main witnesses is Senorita, we don't know her full name, of just her initials, which is CR, and she works at the farm of Don Luis de Diego. Now, this was at night. She was watching TV when she heard this very loud noise, as she described it in, quote, intense whistling noise. Now, at the same time she heard this noise, there was interference on her television screen. So she turned off the TV. It was late at night. She was getting ready to go to bed. And then she went outside to investigate this noise. And I'll just let her describe what she saw, because it's crazy. As she says, "You can't imagine my astonishment when I found that outside on the entrance road there was a weird thing with various lights on it, and near it a man looking at the field of alfalfa that we have there. He was standing there looking fixedly at the field of alfalfa." So apparently he was studying it. She looked at the object, which she said was silver. It wasn't huge, about the size of a car, maybe 12 feet wide, she estimates. Pretty tall, 7 to 8 feet tall, and it had a transparent cupola on top. On top of that, there was a flashing blue light, and there were white, purple, and yellow lights around the circumference. Now, this figure was fairly tall, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, and he was dressed in a dark, tight-fitting garment with a belt and a helmet, and his sort of weird white glowing, what looked like bracelets around his cuffs, his wrists, and around his ankles. So he began walking towards the landed object. This really frightened the main witness, as she says. "I was very scared, so I went back indoors and shut the door. After a while, I heard the whistle again, like at the beginning." So after this whistling sound faded away, she looked outside, and the object was gone. But she did see something else, and that's what makes this case to me so interesting. As the witness says, I could see absolutely clearly that at the spot where the UFO landed, the whole area was shining with a uniform glow. The next morning, even by daylight, you could see quite clearly black footprints at the place. They were boot-shaped, with the heel narrower than the front part of the sole. So yeah, an important case, I think, involving a humanoid, a landing traces, and electromagnetic interference. And it's also so interesting that this figure was staring fixedly at the alfalfa field. I wonder what he was thinking. And so many cases. Here's another one. This occurred in Sioux City, Iowa. This was on September 4, 1974. The main witness is George Hoffman. And he was drawn outside of his home by this glowing object, which hovered at very low level, treetop level, and it was moving in erratic motions, he said, over his alfalfa field. And there were animal reactions. His dog and cattle seemed to react to the presence of this object, and he watched it for about 5 minutes, at which point it darted off into the distance and was gone. So he went to inspect his alfalfa fields, and sure enough, he found a burned semicircle in his alfalfa field. He said it was weird because the ground itself was burned almost white, apparently due to exposure, he guesses, to a high heat source. So again, a really good landing trace case as well as an animal reaction case. And here's another very interesting case. This one occurred in Rochester, Minnesota, and this is on August 3rd, 1975. And there were multiple witnesses to this apparent UFO landing at the alfalfa farm of Willard Anderson. And the first witness to see it was actually Anderson's neighbor, Donald Prigg, who saw a glowing red object land in the field, and it seemed to disappear at this point. So he called his neighbor Willard and told him, and Willard himself didn't see anything, but knowing of this report, he decided to go out the next morning and inspect his field, and this is when he got a surprise. As he says, and I quote, I found a brown patch about 15 by 30 feet in the alfalfa field. I don't know what caused it, but it wasn't there yesterday. And it turns out there were other witnesses. Another witness to this incident was Ivan Benkin, who was driving with his daughter Lisa, and they said they saw a, quote, big red ball of fire. It came down towards the ground, almost looking like it crashed and exploded. So this whole incident drew a lot of attention from the neighbors. A lot of people came in to see this patch of burned ground. But what was interesting, it didn't actually look burned. It looked like it had been exposed to a high heat source. As one person who visited this landing trace said, there were mottled places of green in the brown patch, but the lines of the brown patch were clearly discernible. Now there was some talk of this possibly being a meteor or bolide, but there is no other evidence other than this brown patch, so hard to say for sure. But the witnesses, particularly Donald Prigg, who saw this object himself, they leaned towards the UFO explanation. And here's another case which occurred just 1 month later, and actually in the same state. This is in September 1975 near Starbuck, Minnesota, and the main witness is Gordon Hovendick. Now he usually grew corn, but this year, 1975, he decided to grow alfalfa. And he was out there cutting his third crop when he noticed a dark ring in the middle of his alfalfa field. So he didn't actually see any UFOs. There's no eyewitnesses to that, but there was this mysterious ring. And what's interesting about this is not all the grass was crushed or burned. This was just a ring. So it was 10 feet in diameter, and the ring itself was about 8 inches wide and looked like it had been exposed to a high heat source. It was kind of smoky and powdery gray. Now, this did get into the newspapers, and the author of the newspaper article in the Starbuck Times speculated that this ring might actually be a sort of what investigators might call fairy rings, which are sometimes due to the mushrooms, in particular mycelium mushrooms. He admitted this was only a pure guess. However, the main witness, Gordon, thought this would probably be better evidence of a UFO landing, though again, he didn't actually see any object landing. But again, this was in an alfalfa field. And given that there's so many other cases of UFOs landing in alfalfa fields, I lean towards the UFO explanation. And here's another case, same year, only this case occurred in Mancos, Colorado. This is a tiny little town, and this account comes from a gentleman by the name of Frank Andrews. And it's an interesting story that Frank has to tell, so I'm just going to quote him at some length and let him tell the story in his own words. As Frank Andrews says, "One dark night in 1975, when we were living in Mancos, Colorado, and we were on our way home from visiting my wife's brother in Durango, we witnessed an amazing spectacle overhead in the sky. We pulled off the road for a few minutes to watch this most unusual display of lights. We continued on our way home to ponder what we had just seen. We had read about these encounters, but didn't believe any of it until it happened to us. My wife and I talked half the night away trying to figure out what we had seen. Our new house was on 11 beautiful acres with fantastic views in all directions and ranches all around us. It had taken us a full year to build the place ourselves, and we met many neighbors during that time, and one of these good neighbors was a blacksmith named Epic. He was the real honest-to-good blacksmith from the old days. He used tools of the trade that were out of the westerns: a charcoal forge, huge anvil, hammers, chisels, but lacking all the electrified equipment of modern times. I visited my friend Epic the morning after our night under the lights. I don't remember if I had mentioned our encounter before he showed me his alfalfa field, but what I saw in his field helped me believe more in UFOs. He too had seen the bright lights from his bedroom window, but didn't get up to investigate until after dawn. And as Epic said, "Frank, I've got to show you something really weird." And Frank continues his story. As we walked out in his field, standing knee-deep in the luscious green-blue alfalfa, I observed a perfect circle, about 20 feet across, burnt into Epic's field. This grass crater was only about a mile from where we had seen the bright lights the night before. I asked Epic, "Have you told anyone else about this?" He replied, "No, Frank, I haven't, but I think that I'll call the newspapers." Not sure if he did, but Frank Andrews did, and this is how this article came to be published in the newspapers. It's a pretty interesting case of a UFO landing in an alfalfa field. It's really amazing how many there are. 2 years later, August 17, 1977, this next case occurred in the teeny little town of Arthur, Nebraska. Of course, there's lots of crops grown in Nebraska. And it was at 11 p.m. on August 17 when Janet Magnuson and her cousin Barb Mendenhall were driving on a gravel road. This is about 5 miles east of Arthur, when they saw an object glowing a brilliant dark red moving over the hill to their left. Now Janet slammed on the brakes as the car engine died, and as Janet says in her own words, "It was real huge. maybe as long as a football field. She says that this object had oval windows around the circumference, which she says, quote, emitted the most spectacular red I've ever seen, the most dark, deep red, but the most brilliant red. So this was not a fireball or anything like that. I mean, it had oval windows around it, and she says it was actually football-shaped with a dome on top. So your classic sort of saucer. She said it moved very slowly, and it was inching towards them, rocking back and forth until it was right over the road directly in front of them. She said it was totally quiet and so big that it filled the entire windshield. Now at this point, Janet's cousin Barb started to freak out. She started screaming, and she said, "They're going to get us. I know they're going to get us because they know that we've seen them, because they can see us." So she's totally freaking out. Meanwhile, this object hovered for about 5 seconds and then shot off to the northeast. The two women raced home. They arrived home at 11:20 and both drew sketches of what they had seen. And Janet actually began dreaming about this incident. This is a sign that could be more than just a sighting. And she thinks so because, as she says, "I'd almost like to go under hypnosis because I have a feeling that there's something here I don't remember." It's all very hard to believe. You get to question yourself almost. Now, Janet later learned, and here's the Alfalfa connection, that a rancher in the area saw a UFO hovering over the power lines in his alfalfa field, and he also found a circular burned spot in his field. And this spot was so intense that it would not grow any alfalfa and remained there for a year. More evidence of ETs and their interest in alfalfa. Now here's a weird and slightly different case. This occurred in October 1980. This is near Orbisonia, Pennsylvania, in Huntington County. Now a witness was out picking alfalfa in a field to feed her rabbits. This was something she did regularly, when she saw this huge object, which she says was as big as a house, actually fly directly over her and off into the distance. She ran back into her truck and returned home with the alfalfa she had collected. And that's when she noticed something strange. According to one of their relatives who actually reported this incident to investigators. And I'll quote, "A strange thing happened when the couple arrived home. They placed the alfalfa in the rabbits' cages, but the rabbits did not eat the alfalfa. In fact, they would not even go near the alfalfa. Investigators speculated that some sort of energy field from the UFO may have affected the alfalfa in some way." So this case is important also because there was a huge number of reports from people all over that area at that time. It's not just that one case. Now, this next case became extremely well known as a UFO landing site that was very well verified. This occurred in Aix-en-Provence in France on January 8, 1981. A retired stonemason by the name of Renato Nicolai watched as a UFO landed in the wild alfalfa fields right next to his house. And as he says, "It came down lightly on the ground near my house. I approached it and clearly saw the craft. It was a flat circular object bulging slightly above and below, about 6 feet in height and 7.5 feet in diameter. It was a dull gray, like lead. It was round, and I could see 4 portholes." So Renato walked towards this object when it suddenly took off, making a loud whistling sound. And this is when he saw that the ground where the object had landed showed a circular depression, almost 3/4 of an inch into the ground, so it was quite heavy, and 2 skid marks. So he reported his sighting of this landed object, and scientists arrived to analyze the landing traces and take samples. and they concluded after much analysis that this site had been exposed to strong mechanical pressure and heat. So this object, they estimate, weighed some thousands of pounds, and the heat source had to be at least 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit, so not something you could easily fake. Furthermore, they took samples of the alfalfa, and the chlorophyll was reduced by some 50%. So this is a very strange effect, and one of the scientists, Dr. Bunias, said, and I quote, "I examined the different pigments in the alfalfa, such as chlorophyll and xanthophyll, and these pigments had undergone very important changes near the site, which diminished as the distance from the site increased." So that's an important point. The closer the vegetation was to this object, the more it was affected. And as the doctor says, the vegetation at the site was dried but not burnt or carbonized. We have acknowledged the facts, but we make no statement about their cause. We don't see any confirmation of the existence of flying saucers. We don't give any explanation. That's all. So he's just being careful, objective, and scientific. But what caused this landing trace? Clearly, it was the object seen by Renato Nicolai, and this is considered by UFO investigators to be one of the best landing traces in modern ufology. It's a very, very interesting case. And here's another. January 13, 1981. This occurred in Culpeper County, Virginia. There were numerous witnesses in this very rural area of Culpeper County who saw a UFO at a very low level. One of the witnesses was Ronnie Norman, and he says, "There was just a bunch of damn lights that flooded down. I've never seen anything like it." Another witness was Wanda Dees. She says, "They were like big red glowing torches. They glowed out there for a while. Then everything went black for about 45 minutes or an hour when they came back on again. Then it went up, came back down once again, went up again, and disappeared." A third witness is Robert Lane, and he says, "They looked like balls of floating fire. There was no real pattern to them, but they stayed in one area as it glided down. You could see all the trees lighting up over there, and when it left, it didn't really take off. It just sort of disappeared." So no surprise that these lights were seen over a huge, sprawling field of alfalfa near Route 522. And as it turns out, there's some evidence that this object actually landed, because another witness, John DeVivi, found a round, burned patch on the ground about 14 feet in diameter. Now, some skeptics tried to explain this away as flares, but the witnesses who saw these objects disagree, particularly Wanda Dees, who saw these objects moving up and down, which flares can't do. And they're not going to leave a burned patch on the ground 14 feet in diameter. It's an interesting case. And here, hands down, is my favorite case of this bunch. This one involves landing and humanoid and physical traces. It's really interesting. This occurred in Principato, Italy on October 9, 1984. Now, this was investigated by a UFO researcher by the name of Umberto Tellerico. And the main witness is a 57-year-old farmer by the name of Giuseppe Cocozzo. And he was checking his alfalfa field early in the morning and was actually going to get some food for his cow when he saw a strange short figure, very short, about 3 feet tall, and it looked weird. It was wearing a dark helmet. This figure had a backpack on it with tubes reaching up to the helmet. And according to Giuseppe, the body of this figure looked like it was covered with long, dark brown hair. And it freaked him out. As Giuseppe says, "I stood there looking at him for a bit and thinking, for I have never seen anybody who looked like that." So what's interesting about this is that this figure was holding this weird device, a sort of T-shaped object with 2 points facing to the ground. Kind of like a rake, but definitely not a rake. So Giuseppe was quite frightened by this figure's strange appearance, and at first the figure did not see him, so Giuseppe coughed to kind of get its attention, and it worked. The figure turned and looked at Giuseppe. At this point, Giuseppe could see the guy's face, or where the face should be. In fact, what he saw was a silvery visor on this helmet where the eyes would be. So at this point, he realizes this is not a normal person, and he decided to sort of back off. And as he's kind of walking away, but keeping his eye on this figure, he watched as this figure began to move into some bushes. And this is when he noticed that this figure had what looked like flames being emitted from the side of his torso. And shortly later, Giuseppe watched as this, quote, strange craft, it was square-shaped, actually rose upward, darted around, landed again further off in the fields, then took off. So he's totally freaked out at this point. He runs to his house and gets his gun and returns to the scene. And this is when he found strange imprints in the ground spaced at regular intervals. These were apparently footprints, but not normal footprints. As Giuseppe says, I found footprints. No, not footprints, but rather sort of hoof marks. So queer, truly very queer little hoof marks. So he follows these tracks, and this is when he comes upon an area of crushed grass, apparently where this craft had landed. He called the police, who came to investigate, and they actually called the Italian Air Force, who expressed great interest in this case. And in fact, soil samples were taken. They did not show any unusual radioactivity, though the landing spot itself was emitting heat long after this object had gone away. So this case is also verified by Giuseppe's wife. She said that neither of them had put much belief in UFOs, but when Giuseppe came back into the farm, she could see that he had been badly frightened. Now news of this landing became very well known in the area, and soon more than 1,000 people came to see these holes in the ground created by this craft. And Giuseppe reports, that he had a lot of farm animals, rabbits, chickens, turkey, geese, cattle, cats, and dogs. None of them showed any reaction. But this is a very interesting case of a UFO again landing in an alfalfa field. It's a humanoid, a very unusual humanoid, and some really excellent landing traces. It's quite an unusual case. And like I said, there's so many. Here's another one which occurred 4 years later, and this is in August 1988 in Elmwood, Wisconsin. There had been a flurry of sightings in Elmwood when Charles and Evelyn Hutchins, who lived near the intersections of highways P and D, this is in southwest Dunn County, they found strange circles in their alfalfa fields. So Charles Hutchins says, and I quote, I don't know what to make of them. Farmers from around here who have farmed this land for a long time have never seen anything like this before. I don't know what we're dealing with. I don't have any idea. It's pretty strange. There doesn't appear to be any kind of pattern to them. Who knows how they got there? So these circles and rings were of different sizes, but the width of the markings averaged about 10 to 12 inches of the rings. So there was some speculation that the people who were reporting UFOs were actually seeing Air Force flares, but certainly the witnesses don't think so. And in fact, one of the witnesses, John Dins, said that he saw a huge oval-shaped object with bright lights on it, and that it was so close it frightened his herd of dairy cows. And another witness said that they saw lights moving over a very large area at extraordinary speed. So these could not possibly be flares. Now, according to the report on this case, samples of the alfalfa were collected for analysis, but there's no word, at least in the article that I found, on what the results of these studies were. But definitely an interesting case. And here's another really interesting case, which occurred in Barada, Nebraska. This occurred on October 21st, 1990, and the main witness is Charlie Kirkendall. And he was cutting his alfalfa in his fields when he found 2 circles burned into his field. Both circles were an estimated 15 to 18 feet in diameter, and the alfalfa around the circles was still green and fresh, as was the inside. So this was just the outside rings, which were about 18 to 20 inches wide, that were burned. And these were absolute perfect circles. So what's interesting is agricultural expert from the University of Nebraska came to analyze the alfalfa and the soil. His name is Gerald Hopp, and he says, I don't think it's anything environmental, nothing that we know of. Now, he later speculated that these rings might be caused by violet root rot, but he couldn't explain how these would form perfect 360-degree rings and not damaging the vegetation inside or outside the rings. Now later, Charlie Kirkendall did find a third ring, and this one measured about 12 feet in diameter. And he had no explanation for the circles. He didn't see anything, but word certainly spread about them. In fact, his neighbor, Bud Runyon, said that a hunter told Bud's son, Don, that he had actually seen an object with bright lights land some distance northwest of Kirkendall's farm, and this was around the same time that these weird circles appeared. And then Charlie Kirkendall learned that other neighbors, including Gary Bierman and Chad Scholl, had seen lights while working in their own fields south of Charlie's farm. So there is a pretty well corroborated UFO connection here. More than 100 people in this area came to see these circles, and none could explain them. None had seen anything like this before. Charlie Kirkendall himself is not convinced by Hopp's theory of a fungus, but he stops short of saying aliens are responsible. As he says, I'm convinced that something hovered over that ground. I don't think it lit, but it burned that field. I wish whatever did it would do it again, and I could see it. I'd give anything to see that. Earth is a pebble of sand on a beach in the universe. How do we know what's out there? Anyone who can explain it, please feel free to do so. I like that. Earth is a pebble of sand on a beach in the universe. So true. But Charlie Kirkendall does admit that 5 years earlier, his 22-year-old son, Mike, did see a disc-shaped object come within 500 feet of their farmhouse, lighting up the whole area before whizzing off towards the Missouri River. A pretty interesting case. And I've just got 2 more I'd like to cover. This next one occurred on August 3rd, 1992, in Saskatoon. This is in Saskatchewan, Canada, and the main witness is Phyllis Collins. Now, she didn't see any UFOs, but she wonders if UFOs were responsible for the strange circle of flattened alfalfa that she found in her fields. This circle was about 9 feet wide, and as Phyllis Collins says, I haven't got a clue. I don't know. So they brought some people out to study this, and the scientist, his name is Herman Austenson. He's a crop science professor at the University of Saskatoon, and he flat out ruled out dust devils. He's not quite convinced these are UFOs, but as he says, some people say they are the work of UFOs. I don't have an explanation. I'd like to see one being formed. It's very strange. So he has seen a number of these in this area, and says he's investigated several of them and still has no idea how they are being formed. As Herman Ostenson says in his own words, it's all a mystery until somebody sees something, has a good photo, or witnesses a UFO, or pranksters, or something else causing them. And now for the final case, which occurred actually in Hungary. The exact location is Kiszenes Kondoros, and this occurred in August 23rd, 2000. Now, I originally found this case in Albert Rosale's amazing multi-volume books, The Humanoids Among Us, but the original investigator of this particular case is a gentleman, a researcher by the name of Preston. He's a quite well-known UFO researcher in Hungary. And the witness is an anonymous alfalfa farmer who was on his tractor in his field when he saw a short figure dressed in a tight-fitting red spacesuit. And it was weird because this figure had what looked like short stubs for hands, and the witness was quite intrigued by this figure being so short and dressed in this weird tight-fitting red spacesuit that he drove his tractor right up to the figure to get a closer look. And this figure did not appear to be frightened at all. The main witness could see that this figure was only 2.5 to 3 feet tall. The witness stops his tractor, and get this little figure actually walks around the tractor. This really kind of freaked the main witness out, and he drove off and returned with friends the next day to look for evidence, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Nevertheless, it's another very interesting case of a humanoid wandering around in these alfalfa fields. So weird. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Cases from all over the world, not only sightings, but landings and humanoids. And yeah, it's very clear from the huge number of cases that ETs do have an interest in alfalfa. I think they love it. I think they're eating it just like we do. And I think these cases also provide an enormous amount of evidence in support of ET and UFO reality. That alone makes them important. But I think what's most interesting about them is it shows that they're very much like us. Why else would they be showing an interest in alfalfa? We know it has medicinal properties. We know it's a good food source for both humans and animals. And I think these cases show that they know this too. I love the fact that these have been occurring for decades upon decades and are occurring all over the world, as we have seen, across Europe, across the United States, Canada, all the way down to South America. So very widespread from a number of different sources and very well verified. So that's the show for today. I hope that you found it interesting. I hope it provides some interesting insights into the nature of UFOs and extraterrestrials. Either way, I want to thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And like I always like to say, keep searching for the truth. Keep asking questions. And most important, keep having fun.